So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. This is our July open event, Nudge versus Boost, using behavioral science to drive cultural change at your organization, not the other person's organization, your organization. So this is going to be exciting. Allison is here. You can see her. She's crushing the yellow sport coat today. Shay and I are here as well. But first, let's frame the event. We're Rational Labs. This is an open event, so some people might not know about us, but we've worked with hundreds of the leading companies to create change using behavioral design. Notably, our work started by building the first 25 BE units at Google. Since then, we've run over 100 experiments and we've worked with top companies all over the globe. When we engage with people for consulting, we do product and growth consulting. We also have our BSI community and trainings, of which this event is a part of. And then we do AI and BE strategy sprints. So should you want to work with us, we specialize in acquisition and conversion, engagement and retention, new product development, and holistic strategy review. Additionally, this is my neck of the woods. I'm our Chief Learning Officer. We have this incredible 8-week online behavioral design course and membership. You don't need me to tell you, but these people said things like, I didn't want it to end. I learned lessons to apply professionally and personally. People love it. Shay's going to put that link in the chat if you're interested in our learning and development offerings. Furthermore, before we get to Allison, when you take the course or if you become a member, and Shay will put that link in the chat, you have access to our 2 members only events a month and then our 1 open event. So this month, our CEO, Kristen, came on. She did a teardown of the app Lyft. And then she does Ask Kristen Anything. So you can ask about stuff in the course. You can ask BSI questions in relation to your work or just things in general. Then we had an event last week, which was actually spectacular. How to design your onboarding to drive conversion with one of our in-house behavioral scientists. And yes, we always save the best for the last of the month. So today is Nudge versus Boost. And oh my gosh, my screen sharing just went crazy. Where am I? Hold on. Shay, what happened?
We can still see your screen.
Which screen? Oh, because it went over to
your slides. Yeah.
Okay, cool. It just went into full screen and it confused me. But I'm easily confused. So let's talk about Allison. She started her career as a user experience designer at a little company called Deloitte Consulting. And she has a background in human-centered design that continues to shape her work as a behavioral scientist. She entered the world of behavior science by joining the Common Sense Lab at Duke University's Center for Advanced Hindsight, where she partnered with financial institutions to design and test solutions to help people make healthier financial decisions. Most recently, Allison was a senior behavioral scientist on the product team at Humu. It's an HR product that aims to make work better for everyone, everywhere, by empowering people to improve themselves and the teams around them through behavioral science. She's the author of the Habit Weekly Pro case study on behavioral mapping and has been featured on Action Design Radio, in FinTech Futures, and in a UX Collective. And beyond her formal biography, Allison is just a spectacular, funny, bright, brilliant, entertaining, caring, thoughtful person and mother. So without any further ado, I'm going to stop sharing. Allison, you take it away. We're going to spotlight you because this is all about your insight and wisdom. So thank you for being with us here today.
All right. Now, a moment of truth. Let's see if the screen share really does work.
I know these are the trying questions of our times. Meanwhile, everybody gets to see you looking at your screen, you know, getting excited.
All right.
Awesome.
Is it working?
Yeah, we're perfect. We're perfect. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So before we jump into this topic today, I want to give a little disclaimer up front that I am not an industrial organizational psychologist. I am not an organizational behavior psychologist. And I got to work with many of them at Humu and was very, very fortunate to get to learn from them. So folks in those disciplines are wicked smart. They know a ton about the stuff I'm going to talk about today. And very likely have all their own language and terms and frameworks for some of the things I'm going to talk about. So if you're joining from any of those backgrounds, just know that. However, I'm hoping that in me being the person who's talking about this today, I'm able to make it a little bit more relatable to the way that behavioral economists approach problems. So let's go ahead and dive in. If we can get to the next slide. All right. So companies put a lot of time and effort into crafting values. You have probably looked at a company's values before you've applied or interviewed with them, or maybe you have used them to try to write a good cover letter. But how often do they tend to surface once you're inside an organization? And when done well, company values can be incredibly helpful to an organization. They can do things like serve as a guiding compass for making strategic decisions, serve as criteria for promotions, rewards, dismissal policies. They can help prospective employees assess whether an organization's values match their own. And kind of counterpoint to that, they can help interviewers assess whether a prospective employee will be a good fit. And last but not least, this is my human-centered design background coming out. They can be turned into design principles that shape the products and services a company is offering. Design principles are value statements that describe the most important goals that a product or service should deliver for users and are used to frame design decisions. For example, Atlassian is a company that is doing this really well. And I've heard from some friends that work there that Atlassian's values are infused into just about everything they do. They talk about them every day. And they have core values that they've turned into what they call a personality. You can see that here, a tone that should be used in their externally facing communications that's meant to really embody their values. So this is just, again, kind of an aside, but when values are done really well, they can even inform kind of the products and services that we are putting out there externally, not just how people at our organization behave. And in rare instances, values might already perfectly describe the culture an organization has created, but more often they're aspirational. So they represent the values a company knows it needs to embody to succeed in the future, but currently lacks. And now, if a company creates values that are meant to be aspirational, we need to figure out how to get from where we are today to people behaving in a way that embodies those values. And that requires behavior change, which is so unfortunate because I'm sure everyone that Irrational Labs invites to give these talks hates talking about behavior change, right? No, I'm just kidding. But unfortunately, that does not happen automatically. You can't just put values out there and have people in your organization magically behave in a way that aligns and brings them to life. And unfortunately, many organizations treat a values initiative like a marketing launch, right? It's like a one-time event that's success is measured by the initial attention it receives. But embodying values rather than just unveiling them is difficult. So how do we do it? And the approach is not that dissimilar from Irrational Labs' 3Bs framework, which I'm going to use as a loosely guiding framework for my talk today, because I think many of you here today, especially if you've attended an Irrational Labs bootcamp, are somewhat familiar with this. So the first step in Irrational Labs framework is identifying a key behavior, which involves breaking the desired outcome down into a specific and measurable behavior. So what would it look like to do something similar for company values? And this is something that Humu did really well. Humu's team of behavioral scientists created a comprehensive multi-tiered framework to break high-level values down into drivers, and then themes, and then skills or competencies, and finally into what Humu calls nudges, but I'm going to call boosts, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Our team did this by analyzing information from values frameworks from dozens of Fortune 500 companies and synthesizing research-based best practices about cultural transformation. We used academic and applied research findings to identify core themes that reliably predict positive outcomes for organizations. Themes were cross-checked by other scientists to ensure reliability and to create a really streamlined representative set of competencies for each theme. These competencies were designed to generalize across different roles, levels, and job types. And at the lowest level, these get broken down into recommendations to perform behaviors like recognize a team member's efforts, or facilitate an inclusive meeting, or give actionable feedback. And this framework helped us conceptually and tactically define the problems that we were helping organizations solve. Humu was able to translate lofty goals or values into concrete, visible patterns of behavior. And from there, to nudge individuals, teams, and organizations to improve a little bit each day. Now, this might make more sense if we look at an example. So this is how Humu's driver framework broke down the concept of innovation, which was at the highest level of the framework, or a driver. And underneath that were three themes. First, psychological safety, the shared belief that it's safe to take interpersonal risks as a group. Second, creativity, coming up with novel ideas and showing a willingness to experiment and learn. And then third, ownership, putting your unique skills and ideas to use and having control over how and when you work. And these are three characteristics of an innovative team. So if we dive in further, let's dive into creativity. Humu used the term behaviors to talk about the level in this framework that falls under the themes, but I think that language gets confusing in a behavioral economics world, because we typically talk about behaviors as something much more granular, right? As like a really specific measurable key behavior. And what these essentially are, rather than behaviors, are skills or competencies that an individual at an organization needs to develop in order to body a theme. For each of these skills and competencies, Humu had a vast library of specific action recommendations rooted in science. And those looked like this. Humu calls these action recommendations nudges, which I think is a term that lands really well for sales and marketing purposes. But from an actual behavioral science terminology perspective, they're really much more like something called boosts. And I'm going to get into that distinction a little bit more in a minute. By sending these short science-backed suggestions to perform bite-sized actions to individuals at an organization, Humu was working to help those individuals build skills or competencies. So each Humu nudge came with an action recommendation. You can see that's kind of the text at the top right under the title. And then underneath, the scientific rationale to communicate to the individual in lay language why they ought to perform this action. And Humu would send these nudges on a regular cadence to employees at our customers, typically weekly through email, Slack, and Teams. So imagine that a company is working on trying to become more innovative, right? We saw that kind of piece of the framework in the last slide. And as part of that, they want to increase creativity. And as part of that, they want employees to learn the skill of questioning the status quo. Managers at that organization might receive a nudge like number 4 here. Spread leadership around. The next time an issue comes up, don't immediately fix it or explain it away. Instead, ask who wants to step up to lead the team in investigating the problem and finding a solution. Why? By getting behind your team and helping them challenge the status quo, you push them to be more innovative. Bonus, you'll also boost their motivation. So this is how Humu breaks down high-level company values into very specific behaviors that individuals at an organization can perform. And I have been dancing around the difference between boosts and nudges for the last few slides now. So I know that's the title of this talk, and I'm going to dive us into that now. So A lot of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with nudges, but probably less familiar with boosts. So first, let's do a quick refresher on what a nudge actually is so that we can contrast it with a boost. A nudge refers to any aspect of a choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. In other words, it's changing some aspect of a decision-making environment in a way that steers people in a particular direction while preserving their freedom of choice. For example, you can see here that Homer decides to get fruit for a snack at the store because the donuts have been moved further away to a less convenient location. This is unlikely based on what we know of the character Homer, but you get the idea. This is a pretty typical nudge. Make it slightly harder, or slightly easier to choose the healthy option, slightly harder to choose the unhealthy option. And in contrast, a boost is an intervention that enlists human cognition, the environment, or both, to foster people's existing competencies or develop new ones. In other words, it's helping individuals build the skills to make good decisions, applying behavioral science by and for themselves. So, to contrast the example in the last slide of changing the choice architecture so that Homer chose fruit instead of donuts, if we were to design a boost to help people choose healthy snacks, we might help them develop the skill of reducing friction for their future selves to make better snack choices by meal prepping veggies and then keeping them in the fridge ready to grab. So let's compare and contrast nudges and boosts just a little bit to make sure that we're clear on those differences. And I'm sure there's an exception to every rule. There's some gray area between these two, but teasing them out will be kind of a helpful exercise to how we really try to drive behavior change, to drive cultural change in an organization. So if we think about what these two are targeting with their interventions, nudges are aimed at changing somewhat immediate behavior, while boosts are trying to build skills or competencies. And how are they doing that? Boosts seek to foster people's cognitive and motivational competencies, whereas nudges adapt the environment to people's cognitive and motivational processes and leave those competencies somewhat unaltered. And regarding how durable these types of interventions are, the idea is that boosts ultimately change behavior, for example, healthier food choices, better financial decisions, managers recognizing good work from their reports by enhancing existing competencies or establishing new ones, and that those competencies or skills, once in place, remain somewhat stable over time. If it's done well, the behavioral effects of a boost should stick around once that kind of intervention's removed. And this lines up with a kind of company value change that we're trying to drive. Organizations really want to build competencies so that their people can get better and stay better. Nudges, in contrast, change behavior by adapting the choice architecture, leaving those individual competencies unchanged. So as a result, once the intervention is removed, behavior is more likely to revert to the pre-nudging state. Boosts also have the goal of really preserving personal agency and enabling individuals to exercise that agency. So individuals choose to engage or not to engage with a boost. And because of this, it's somewhat safe to assume that when a boost successfully changes behavior, it's reflecting the individual's genuine motivation. And a successful nudge doesn't necessarily reflect such genuine motivations. But this last piece is also where nudges really shine, right? They don't need to be accepted. They don't need people to be on board. they can just change behavior somewhat unknowingly. And this whole requires cooperation piece of boosts is really, really hard because it means that they have to matter to people. People have to be on board, and that requires motivation. So we've talked about how to break these high-level values down into really specific behaviors. Now let's talk about the other two B's, barriers and benefits. I'm going to jump ahead and talk about benefits next, based on what we were just discussing. So even if we send individuals really bite-sized action recommendations that don't take a ton of effort to act on, we can't just assume that people at our organization are going to care about our company values and be motivated to change their behavior to align with them. We need to help them build that motivation. Before I jump into this next slide, I just want to note that the framework I'm going to share on this next slide is pulled from Amy Bucher's work, because Amy does a really lovely job breaking this down. All right. It is typical for people to talk about motivation as something that has an amount. The more motivation someone has, the likelier they are to do something. But the self-determination theory of motivation takes that one step further to consider not just motivational quantity, but also its quality. It's not just about how much motivation someone has, but also what's fueling that motivation. The more controlled a type of motivation is, the more it's imposed onto someone from the outside. The more autonomous it is, the more it's generated by the person from within. And the controlled forms of motivation are the weakest. But as people find personally meaningful reasons to do something, their motivation takes a stronger and more autonomous form. So we're going to talk about kind of some different types of motivation across this spectrum, and then also ways that an organization could seek to foster those types of motivation. The first type of motivation on this spectrum is really not motivation at all. Amotivation refers to when a person has no motivation. And people who fall into this category are highly unlikely to take even the first step towards behavior change. So ideally, an organization would screen out these candidates by including a values interview as part of their hiring process, right? That should allow an organization to screen out individuals who seem very unmotivated to change behavior to align with company values. But sometimes people may be pushed into the behavior change arena by forces outside their control. Most commonly, these forces take the form of someone nagging you or a financial incentive to make a change. Someone who's motivated to apply or motivated to try a behavior for purely extrinsic reasons can be said to have external motivation. This could take the form of designing your performance management process to include an assessment of how well individuals are reflecting your company values. This could also take the form of something like an individual's manager insisting they develop a new skill or competency. And over time, people may internalize others' expectations for them. The word should is a clue that this might be happening. I should ask for more constructive feedback. I should try to emphasize more with our customers. When the external forces causing motivation are internalized, people experience introjected motivation. So maybe an individual's manager insists on the importance of them developing a new skill long enough that they begin to internalize that they ought to. Now we shift over to the autonomous side, the stronger forms of motivation, where a person begins to have their own reasons for wanting to do a behavior. The first type of motivation on the autonomous side of the scale is identified motivation. When a person sees a behavior as instrumental in achieving something they value, so a means to an end, they may not be very interested in the behavior for its own sake, but it's an important stepping stone for them to get where they want to be. For example, maybe an individual recognizes that in order to get promoted at an organization, they need to develop some new skills. It's possible for a person to see a behavior as reinforcing an important value or part of their identity. When a behavior is important because it supports someone's identity or values, that person has integrated motivation. This can happen when individuals choose to join a company because of shared values. And some organizations try to create this by emphasizing things like everyone is a leader, or creating easy to remember catchphrases that might embody some sort of theme or competency. For example, the competencies championing experimentation or try new ways of doing things that we saw earlier in that driver framework slide under innovation could be captured by the commonly tossed around phrase fail fast, right? And so if people can recite that, Humu's fail fast, that would be Humu employees having integrated motivation for that kind of thing. And the final and most autonomous form of motivation is intrinsic motivation. This happens when a behavior is enjoyable purely for its own sake. So an example here might be people who invest quite a bit of time in mentoring others just because they enjoy helping people. Now, this is really tricky because organizations need to figure out how to instill individuals with quality motivation to build these new skills or competencies that help them embody values. So the types over in the autonomous bucket. However, for an organization to show that its values really do matter, it's important for incentives not to be misaligned to values. So even though something like tying raises to individuals demonstrating these competencies would be just on its own in that external motivation bucket, it's still an important piece of the puzzle. If one of your company values is something like looking out for each other, you shouldn't reward the person who's exceeding sales targets by throwing their peers under the bus, even though ideally you want people to be looking out for each other just because they love doing it or because they see it as part of who they are. All right, so we have talked about a ton of ways that an organization could increase motivation for individuals to develop these competencies. Now let's talk about that third B, barriers. How can we make it easy for people to do it? And this is where I think nudges are really important to layer on top of boosts, because you can do all those things we talked about in the last slide. Hire for certain values, have managers emphasize and coach the skills that align to the values, tie them to compensation and promotion, try to build an identity around them. But at the end of the day, we are still irrational beings. We still deal with things like time scarcity and the deadline effect and tunneling and limited attention. And we can't just totally train away our decision-making biases. We still need a little bit of help overcoming the gap between our intentions and our actions. And this is why boosting and nudging together is the most powerful. So by leveraging behavioral economics principles, or nudges, if you will, such as defaults, prompting people when they're most receptive, decreasing friction, and implementation intentions to remove barriers to action, we can increase the likelihood that individuals are going to act on a boost. Nudges and boosts really don't have to be either or. So let's walk through an example. We can take the Humu value, invest. We look out for our future selves to build Humu in a better world. One major driver of this value is learning, which can be broken down into multiple themes, including growth mindset. The belief that skills and habits are not fixed, but can be developed over time. Developing a growth mindset involves developing multiple skills or competencies, such as learning from mistakes or reframing challenges. But one of those skills is the skill, this is kind of meta, the skill to develop new skills and abilities, right? To really believe that you can change. And individual contributors at an organization need to learn how to be good learners and to look out for their own development, developing new skills and abilities for themselves. But managers also need to learn how to help their reports develop new skills and abilities. And one specific way that they can do that is meeting with them and asking questions about what skills they're interested in growing and how they can help them develop those skills. So a boost would be sending a manager a recommendation for what kinds of questions to ask about growth in their one-on-ones with their reports. But a nudge would be finding a way to make it the default for managers to ask those questions. And there might be many ways to try to make this the default, but one way would be to try to auto-populate this recommendation into a manager's one-on-one agenda with their reports. So in order to do this, Humu built a one-on-one agenda tool so that we could auto-populate those boosts as recommended topics within agendas. And in this way, this is in a way leveraging the power of defaults, which is the idea, as you can see here, that people pick the easiest option to avoid complex decisions. Defaults provide a cognitive shortcut and signal what people are supposed to do. And this example isn't really a default in the truest sense because people still have to opt into talking about it, but it does send a really strong signal about what a manager in a report ought to be talking about in a one-on-one and provides a shortcut for them when putting an agenda together. Timing also really matters. A classic behavioral economics tactic is to prompt people when they're most likely to be receptive. So the same boost when delivered at different times could have drastically different levels of success. Let's walk through another example. We can take the Humu value, execute. We do our best work always. And one major driver of this value is clarity, right? Having clarity on what good work even looks like so that we can do our best work, which can be broken down into multiple themes, including goal setting, defining, working towards, and achieving clear milestones. There are a lot of skills that go into doing that well, setting good goals, making sure personal goals align with team and company goals, evaluating and communicating our progress towards our goals. But for the sake of this example, we're going to focus on that first step, setting clear and achievable goals. And once again, individual contributors need to learn how to set good goals, but managers also ought to be coaching them to do so and helping them refine those goals. The criteria for a good goal, SMART goals, is so widely known that it's really easy to just kind of roll one's eyes at it. But that doesn't mean everyone's actually good at remembering to apply it when it matters and using it to coach others to set really good goals. Also, so you can ignore these numbers on the pictures of these next few boosts. This is just because I pulled them from the public internet, so don't let that distract you. If you have an entire values framework broken down into lots of themes, competencies, and boosts, it's important to think about when people would actually be responsive to acting on something like this. And this also has to do with time scarcity and tunneling. If we want to have any chance at all of busy managers turning their attention towards something like helping their direct reports set really clear goals, we had better send it at a time when it falls inside rather than outside their tunnel of attention. So the best way to drive behavior change when it comes to managers coaching their reports to write good goals would be to time this perfectly. For example, figure out when managers are supposed to be reviewing drafts of their report's personal objectives and key results for the year, and then pair a reminder of that timeline with a boost like this. And this is similar to the idea of just-in-time education within the financial realm, which we talked about a lot during my time at the Common Sense Lab. Fernandez, Lynch, and Nettemeyer found that financial education interventions had very little impact on people's financial decisions. And financial education is pretty similar to something like a manager training. The effects disappear with time. We don't recall the information when we need it, etc. Education is more effective when there's less time between the intervention and the action. So what was effective in the financial realm and what we want to do in the workplace as well is to give employees the information they need in bite-sized pieces right before they would have the opportunity to act on it. And goal setting season is just one example of this. The opportunities really are endless. So relevant boosts could be timed with something like right when a one-on-one is about to start, right when a team meeting is about to start. We could time boosts for giving good feedback with performance season, with a new hire or a team member departure. The point is really prompting employees with information right when they have the opportunity to apply it. Another really powerful way to make it easier to act on a boost is to decrease friction. People can be deterred by taking action from seemingly small barriers, like having to pull up a boost in another window or platform. A really helpful way to decrease friction is to boost people in the flow of their work. In other words, in the products that they're using that are most relevant to these competencies that we're building. So things like performance management tools, team collaboration tools, wherever they manage their work calendar. And for this example, we are going to work with that same Humu value from the last slide, execute. We do our best work always. And as we discussed, one major driver of this is clarity, which can be broken down into multiple themes. This is where we're deviating from the last slide. And we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities, making sure everyone has a clear sense of who's doing what. There are a lot of skills that go into doing that well, but one of them is holding yourself and others accountable to respective roles and responsibilities. And one way to do that is to make sure everyone's on the same page at the end of a meeting about the roles and responsibilities created as a result of that meeting. So you can see in this boost, it says, ask for a synopsis. At the end of your next few meetings, get into the habit of asking a team member to summarize the group's overall goals and next steps. Be sure to rotate who you ask. If it becomes clear that the team isn't on the same page, step in to resolve misunderstandings. Now, if we really want people to do this, the best way would be to figure out how to pipe this recommendation into the description of the calendar event for the next few meetings when they'll meet with their team. So it's right there to remind them when they're pulling up the invitation. But sometimes there are really good science-backed ways that we can prompt people to behave, to develop a skill or a competency, but that requires some prior planning on their part. And that's where implementation intentions come in. Implementation intentions refers to the behavioral economics principle that people are more likely to do something when they specify how, when, and where they will do it. These kinds of if-then plans are very effective at translating vague desires into concrete action plans that might actually come to fruition. So again, let's walk through an example. We can take this time a Duke value, discovery. We seek to be an innovative community, to improve our individual capabilities, and to share knowledge with one another. One major driver of this value is innovation, which, as we saw earlier, can be broken down into multiple themes, including psychological safety, the shared belief that it's safe to take interpersonal risks as a group. And creating this shared belief involves developing certain skills or competencies across this group, such as encouraging healthy debate, navigating conflict respectfully. But one of the competencies it requires is the ability to learn from mistakes, right? Innovation by nature requires that we try things that might not work out, but instilling this sense that it's okay to take risks and sometimes things don't work out and we learn from it, instilling that into a team is really hard. And one way to inch towards that shared belief would be to encourage managers and leaders to share personal failures. But this isn't the kind of thing that you could just like pop into an agenda or the description of a calendar invite to say, share a time you made a mistake, right? An individual would need some time to reflect and think of something they're comfortable sharing that's relevant to a certain group. So enter implementation intentions. If we prompted a manager or leader to create implementation intentions for what, when, and where they'll share a mistake, and then follow up with them about it, they would be much likelier to act on a boost like this. All right, those were just 4 examples of how we could apply nudging tactics on top of boosts to help remove barriers and to make the boosts easier to act on. But there are many more ways. I just want to make sure that I leave time for questions so I don't get to talk about them all today. And I want to quickly say, while I focused on barriers as the place to infuse behavioral economics concepts or nudges, we could also design nudges in a way that's increasing motivation, right? That benefits of the 3B. For example, loss aversion, combine a boost about creating structure for your team or giving recognition with a note for managers, or with a note that managers who score highly on creating things like structure or giving recognition for their team have lower turnover on their teams by X amount. Or one more example, cognitive dissonance. Remember integrated motivation, the type that's doing this as part of who I am? We could prompt that sense of identity in something like being generous with time or being a good mentor to increase motivation for managers to behave in a way that's consistent with their beliefs and work with their reports on their development. So in summary, we create values, we break them down into skills and competencies, we nudge and boost on those competencies, and measure and reward whether people are developing those competencies that brings the values to life. Right, I'm very happy to take questions.
Yeah, Allison, thank you so much. Before we go into Q&A, I think if everybody could give a virtual or real, you can just randomly unmute and give a round of applause. Thank you for, oh, look at that. Already 12, oh, real unmutes. I love it. I love it. Look at that. So thank you so much. It was incredible. And I think people really, really, really enjoyed the examples. Before we pivot over to questions, because there are a lot dropping in the chat and Shay and I are working to catch them all, just note, I'm trying to put together all those links that I was giving you in real time. So hopefully I'll do a recap while Allison does the Q&A here. I did get the Irrational Lab link recap, and I'm working on all the resources that Allison shared. So hang tight. I'll try and put them in one bundle for you. That said, let's see here. Shay, did you have a question?
I've got one I could pull, yeah. So Hunter was asking about the mental model around nudges versus boosts. So I was just curious if you could just like one more time, just give a succinct kind of like mental model around a nudge versus a boost, in summary.
Yeah, so if I try to use kind of as lay language as possible, a nudge is trying to change someone's behavior by changing the environment around them to kind of guide them towards a certain behavior in a way that they may not even realize that you're doing. Whereas a boost is saying, hey, here's a recommendation for how to act based on what science says, and trying to really teach people to use some principles of behavioral science to really create change by and for themselves. And so there's much more personal agency involved. And it's really about kind of teaching people to apply those skills for themselves. Hopefully that was both
Awesome.
succinct and clear.
Yeah, one's environmental and one's educational. I mean, in emphasis, right?
Oh, very much so.
I'm gonna call
I thought that was wonderful.
I'm gonna call that the 2 E's to go with the 3 B's. So Nicholas Green has a question. He says, I'm clear on how we can A/B test. Maybe he's saying he's not clear. Nicholas, you can clarify on how we can A/B test the efficiency of nudges. Can we have an example how boost impact can be measured? That's right. No, he is clear on how you measure nudges. He's not clear on how you measure boosts.
Very
Yeah.
fragile.
Was someone speaking?
Maybe.
So measurement of boosts like Humu used is a huge challenge. How do you measure whether something is happening that's happening outside of your platform? And we had similar challenges at Duke sometimes. I'd be working with a financial institution, and that financial institution would be kind of just one small slice of an individual's financial picture. So we couldn't really measure things like how much debt do they have overall? How much are they saving for emergencies? And so Humu has tried measuring the effectiveness of boosts in a few different ways, but I think that the company is really still on a journey. And one way that we have tried is measuring intention. So every boost comes with this kind of little reaction, quick poll question that says, I plan to do this. Yes, no, I already do this. And so individuals can respond about whether they plan to do it. However, as behavioral economists, we recognize that there's a huge gap between people's intentions and their actual behavior. And so this is more of a measure of engagement than whether people are actually following through on their intentions. The other way to measure behavior is to build surfaces that allow users to engage with those boosts in a way that captures more signals. And so that is, in essence, what Humu was doing with the one-on-one agendas, right? That allowed people to add boosts that they received via email, Slack, and Teams straight into a one-on-one agenda. And then when they talked about it in that one-on-one, they could click discussed, and we would know, oh, like they actually, this actually informed the conversation, they acted on it. But building those kinds of surfaces for, every every type of interaction that boosts are working to change behavior around, team meetings, casual interactions, like is tricky. And the thing that's tricky about that is that organizations already often have platforms they use for a lot of these things. And so another way to do it would be trying to create partnerships with very common like workplace collaboration tools to try to measure some of these things. But at the end of the day, it's just a huge challenge in this space. And we are recommending a lot of behaviors that happen through human interactions and don't have kind of a natural mechanism for a data signal to be captured about whether or not it's occurred. And so even if those opportunities to collect data exist, there has to be something motivating individuals to provide that data back, right? We can't just like send out a survey and be like, did you do your boosts this month? Like, people aren't super motivated to provide that back. And one of our talented data scientists at Humu, Tom Nolan, was working really hard on kind of driving better measurement of boosts when I left last month. And so I hope that he's able to continue that work and drive some creative solutions to this.
Awesome. That was a great answer. I'm looking here. We have a question from Kate Ling. She has a couple questions here. So she's re-upped them. How were boosts and nudges tied to promotional criteria at Humu? Then they have an issue with measuring these values in a way that's visible, comparable within the same team, department, etc. And that's followed up with, how do you know when the managers were about to meet or set an agenda for meetings? So I guess those are very much two questions. So did Humu use these things for boosting, and how did you figure out timing pieces?
The timing pieces I'll answer first, because that's a quicker answer and I don't want to forget the question by the time I answer the first one. So the answer to how to do that would be calendar integration. So figuring out how to get people at an organization to give Humu permission to their calendar so that we could time their boosts better, and then using something like machine learning to actually predict when something was a team meeting, like using like HR information systems data about who reports to a certain manager, and are they meeting with all of those people, and then we would know that we could send a nudge at a certain time. And so that's essentially the timing piece, but that can be tricky just with data permissions and organizations wanting to allow calendar access and individuals wanting to add calendar access. And so it's not always kind of a universal strategy. The first one, I think the first question was about how to, can you just repeat that first question?
I'll clarify, because I realized I used a sort of non-defined term when I said these. What I meant was, we're showing these values, the Humu values, tied to promotional criteria, and to some extent it is maybe related to another question here, but and how did they measure that in some sense? But the other person was asking, like, how did you measure the boosts? How would you measure that the values, like that people were living the values because maybe of these boosts, but maybe their own intention, whatever. But how did you tie that into then promotional criteria, if it was?
Yeah. So this is something that industrial organizational psychologists are excellent at. And I can tell you kind of what I learned from them about how it's done, which is many organizations, as part of kind of the annual performance evaluation process, might run surveys about their manager's effectiveness, where they survey all of the reports, or they might run a 360-degree feedback survey. And industrial organizational psychologists are trained at writing survey items for those surveys that kind of accurately capture whether somebody is exhibiting a certain behavior. And so we would work with our customers to essentially break their values down into a framework for behavior change, and then also kind of co-create a survey that was accurately kind of capturing whether individuals and how well individuals were exhibiting those competencies. And I will say that sometimes those were just used for developmental purposes. You know, hey, here's feedback about how you can improve. Sometimes they were used for performance evaluation. And that's a kind of whole can of worms in the industrial org psych world, because if you give people feedback that's purely developmental, then people tend to be much more honest in answering those surveys. If they know that it affects somebody's chances of promotion and their compensation, then they tend to kind of inflate their responses. And so I can't get into that whole can of worms, and frankly, I'm probably not the best person for it, but the short recap answer is kind of including validated items in a survey that capture really well how somebody is exhibiting these competencies and really observable behaviors.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks for clarifying the question. Shay, do we have a final question that you feel strongly about that we should bring to light before we call it a wrap?
Yes, earlier chat, the person's, but he was curious how intrinsic motivation might relate to flow states, or if you've seen any research about that. Just felt like there was a fair amount of overlap.
Ooh, I'm sure there is a whole lot of overlap. I would not call myself the expert on that, so I think I'm gonna choose not to comment on it.
I respect that. Yeah, good to know where it's good to speak. Yeah.
No, that was funny because it goes back to your disclaimer. You're like, I'm not a psychologist, but that said, let's leave you. I did, while we're asking questions, I do have the bonanza of link collection about to drop. But before we do that, and thank you to other folks that were sharing lists. Maybe Allison, if you could give us one thing, if there was one nugget of wisdom you wanted us to take away from this talk today, what would it be? And other people can put their nuggets of wisdom in the chat too. We can have competing nuggets.
Yeah, I'd love to know what those nuggets are from you all, but I think for me, it's just that there is tons of opportunity to apply behavioral economics to people and culture problems in the workplace. And I had a really interesting thing happen when I stepped into Humu, where I was like the token behavioral economics person on a whole team of like industrial organizational psych folks and organizational behavior and management folks, and kind of just felt like, oh, what am I doing here? And that is why I really wanted to harp on kind of the beauty of using boosts and nudges together, because that's essentially what I was doing while I was at Humu, is finding those opportunities to, pull from our decision-making biases and heuristics to really kind of drive the typical approaches used to change behavior in the workplace and make them kind of even more effective. And so if you are a burgeoning or current behavioral economist and you're like a little bit intimidated about like, should I like jump into the HR and the people space? Like, is that somewhere I belong? That's somewhere you can absolutely belong.
No, and you've had such an incredible journey. I mean, from kind of the most traditional consulting to kind of socially motivated BSci to people operations. I mean, very, very interesting view of the landscape in terms of applications here. So again, how about an encore round of applause, bonus for unmutes? Thank you so much for your time, wisdom, energy, and insights today. I want to boost and nudge everybody. No, that I shouldn't do that because I can't do that fast enough. Differentiate the two. That would be terrible. So I just want to say thank you, everybody. Check out all the links we dropped. Reach out to any of us on LinkedIn or on, if you're a member in the Slack. We're here to help. Should you want to partner with the Rational Labs, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, Allison, Shay, everybody for your time, energy, and have a brilliant, wonderful, beautiful weekend. Take care, everyone.
You too. Thank you.